So there's a bunch of good stories and one Russian creepypasta archive, based on tales told by Anon's grandpa, who worked as a police investigator in Soviet Union and 90s Russia. Those stories are basically posts made by the Anon on one of the Russian image boards many years ago. To my knowledge, there is no English translation of these stories, even though they're all pretty good, and they're all based on actual police cases Anon's grandfather worked on. Since I speak Russian, would some Anons here like me to translate them? I am asking because there's a shitload of text, and I wouldn't want to do all this work if no one here is interested in this stuff. These days, I don't even know what X is about anymore. So gentlemen, I've managed to find a cable for my cheap photo camera, and that means that this is time for some exciting tales. As I already said, my late grandpa served in Militsiva. Translator note: Militsiva is a name for police forces in Soviet Union and many Warsaw Pact countries. In the Soviet Union and till the very end of the 90s. To be more precise, he was an inspector in the Sol Militsiva station in a small town near Moscow. He was a very tight-lipped, solemn man, but when you asked him about his work, he usually became more talkative. In my opinion, work was the only thing he loved in his life. So when I was younger, I was interested in paranormal stuff, even back then. I spent a lot of evenings in his kitchen, inquiring about the most interesting cases of his career. After my grandfather died, I found a thick notebook that he apparently used as a diary of sorts that he'd keep in his personal cabinet. In that diary, there was a collection of the most, let's say, curious cases. I've managed to get this diary from my grandma a few times, and reading it, I was always thinking about my grandpa as some mathematician. No literature style, no personal opinions, only confirmed cold facts, such as place where corpse was found, a criminologist evaluation, suspects, and stuff like that. A few theories and a couple of notes. I think he kept working on these cases in his free time, trying to solve these riddles. Most of his notes correlated with stories he told me when I was a child. But there were also a few that I never heard about. In case you suddenly enjoy some of these stories, I might even pay a visit to my grandma and ask her to let me flip through a few pages of that diary, read up on some cases I'm not familiar with, and make a few photos of the former scenes of crimes. Later, we can even try to guess what happened there. As I have said, I wanted to write some sort of book about those cases, so I will provide you with some photos that I already got with some additional notes. But don't expect all my photos to be exact crime scenes, for obvious reasons. In some cases, I was too chicken to enter particular houses because neighborhoods here, as the town in general, are all full of certain criminal elements, and if you enter some shitty hostel full of ex-cons and drug addicts, you might simply never leave it. And some places got intercoms these days. I will also add that there will be no Popo Bawas. Translator note: Popo Bawa is an evil spirit from Zanzibar. That is also a bit of a meme on Russian X, because the name sounds funny in Russian. Something like ass joker. No colorful descriptions of monsters and stuff like that. Many cases have serious mystical undertones, but with some imagination, you probably can explain it within a framework of habitual phenomena. But I can promise you a bit of noir dismemberment and romantic of piss-stained staircases in apartment complexes. Oh yes, I would also ask you not to get all booty blasted about quality of my photos. I'm no photographer, and instead of a proper camera, I got this digital piece of shit. Well, let's start. First case I want to tell you about happened in 93, and it is particularly interesting because no one managed to explain what happened there. I will add a few photos to this post. First has an apartment complex where it happened. Second, an exact place where the body was found. Second stairwell between the 3rd and 4th floors, if you absolutely must know. So around 10 o'clock in the evening, an investigatory operative group. In this small town, it consisted of regular random cops, but usually had an investigator. Translator note: Soviet/Russian analog of detective rank, and an expert criminologist, was called in on a report about discovery of a corpse. And this is what they saw on the staircase: a human body leaking a shitload of blood, head separated from torso and lying not far away, lacerations as if someone chewed him. According to my grandpa, his clothes, that consisted of training pants, sweater, and slippers, torn in a dozen of places. Also, some smaller injuries on his naked skin. It was instantly obvious that this corpse was fresh, which was confirmed by criminologists on the scene. Rigor mortis hasn't set in, which indicated less than 2 hours passed since the moment of his death. This was confirmed later during the interrogation of victim's inconsolable widow, who lived on the 4th floor and whose door was like 3 meters from the body. By the way, she was the one who actually found and reported the corpse. The widow was clearly an alcoholic and already had time to get wasted, but nonetheless, she did provide some information. Her husband left the flat around 9:30 in the evening to take out some garbage. When 15 minutes passed, she started to worry that he decided to stop and chat with his drinking buddies, who usually sat near the entrance of the apartment complex, drinking. Windows of their flat provided no overview of the yard outside, if I recall correctly, so she decided to go downstairs herself to look for him. But the moment she left the flat, she saw a disfigured body of her husband in a pool of blood. She failed to provide any more details during the later questionings. Now, for the interesting part. Interrogations of the inhabitants of that complex provided literally no additional information. Not a single one of them heard any ruckus, screams, or sounds of fighting. Nothing. And that is considering the shitty non-soundproof doors people had back then. There was also indeed a bunch of drunkards sitting at the porch downstairs. According to them, they were hanging out there since around 8 in the evening. And in all that time, only some old lady who lived on the 1st floor and a single mother who lived on the 2nd entered the complex. Both of them also heard and saw nothing. During that time, not a single person left the complex. By the by, my grandfather almost instantly suspected some sort of large dog. What else could dismember a person in such manner in the middle of civilization? Later investigation revealed that there were 2 dog owners in that complex, but their dogs were not nearly big enough to inflict such wounds, which was also later confirmed by the coroner. The head was indeed separated from the body, as if with the teeth of a large animal. His spine was literally grinded in places. Also, one of his legs had very clear markings of jaws. According to the coroner, it looked very deliberate, as if left there intentionally. Every single tooth of both lower and upper jaw left a clean mark, which almost never happens in normal coroner's practice. That one sure never seen such a thing. Jaws indeed were similar to a dog's, but a really big one. And there were 48 of those teeth marks there, while normal dogs only have 42. Sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less, but rarely, and not by much. Now, a couple of my own comments. Large dogs are indeed capable to separate grown man's head from his body in 15 to 20 minutes. I can confirm this as an owner of a large dog. No, my dog didn't kill anyone, but can chew through a large bone in around 10 minutes. But there would be a fuckload of noise and shouts. Okay, if dog somehow managed to rip that guy's vocal cords in the first bite, there wouldn't be any more shouts, which I guess is possible considering the size of those jaws. But how can no one notice a huge ownerless dog entering/exiting the apartment complex? Such animals tend to be remembered. Another strange thing is that the blood was only found near the body. There was no blood on the stairs themselves, neither above nor below. As if he was first put on the floor, then got his head calmly chewed off in silence. My dog attacked a homeless dog once. There was a lot of blood. It was fucking dripping from its jaws and chest all the way home. And let me remind you that humans have much more blood than a dog. Nothing like that here. Everything is crispy clean. So we have something big that appeared on the staircase between the floors. That house had no garbage chute, if you would like to entertain such a wild theory of its method of movement. Silently chewed grown man's head off. Left a dozen of injuries on his body without any signs of resistance, and then disappeared. So it goes officially. The case was explained by a wild dog attack, and closed the fuck down, not before informing all the local dog catchers that they should do their work better in the future. This story also happened around 93, in that same small town near Moscow. I tried and failed to Google anything about it, and I've never heard anyone discussing it here, in this town. So I guess there's no reason to give away the name. To be quite honest. My gramps worked in local militsiva, and I asked him about that case many times. So I guess I didn't completely imagine it, even though I was like 4 years old back then, and my memories are a bit foggy. Back then, young women started to disappear in our town. Absolutely normal girls, not some criminal girlfriends or anything, according to my grandpa. In a single month, 6 of them disappeared, and then the 7th was lost. Her father was a trainer in the local boxing club, popular with both sportsmen and local thugs. From a whole bunch of his clients and friends who were willing to help him, he created some sort of militia patrol aimed at looking for his daughter and preventing similar abductions in the future. This militia started to stroll around the neighborhood in small groups, and one night, I woke up from some loud noises from the outside. I ran to my window and saw my mother and father standing there, looking at a bunch of guys who were trying to widen some tiny cellar window that was right under mine, first floor, with sledgehammers. Now for some facts from my gramps. Guys from one of these patrols saw 3 guys carrying something big towards that cellar. They immediately ran after them, but those 3 guys somehow managed to close the heavy steel cellar door before they were caught. I later learned that they also built a barricade from some garbage lying inside when they realized that guys from militia are not joking. So the militia guys called in all the others and broke into the basement, through that window where they found those 3 crazy fuckos armed with knives and girl's already dismembered body. I know now that there was also a handwritten book in unknown language. It was later apparently lost or stolen right from the evidence box. A hacksaw for metal, and a dog's skull. Walls and floor was covered in some symbols written in chalk, which were mostly destroyed under the feet of 24 boxers who entered the basement, but nothing of value was lost, I guess. By the time cops arrived, those 3 guys were already heavily beaten by the boxers. 2 of them got crippled for life. 1 actually died. Few boxers received some superficial cuts. Interrogation by raging father gave no results. Same as later interrogations by militsiva. Many traces of blood were found in that basement, though, from different people and from a long period of time. As you can expect, no bodies were found, even though search parties combed through every neighborhood and nearby forest. The 2 survivors kept their silence. Come to think of it, those guys were some sort of fucked in the head, neat necromancy, cosplayers or something, and they even managed to hide those bodies very well. Imagine what smarter people, with no mental issues, could do. Second case. I just stumbled upon those photos, so I guess I'll tell you about them. I have to warn you that some people might not find it too scary, but this case always captivated me. There's something about it. Also, when I once saw some tiny lights in the woods at night, I figuratively shat my pants. It will be longer than the first one, but do prepare yourselves, for I have no fucking idea how long the third one will be either. It happened in the winter of 95. One evening, around 8 o'clock, a strange visitor came to the local militsiva station. A priest of the local church, which, by the way, happens to be in the middle of fucking nowhere. He came to report threats he has been receiving for some time now. Priest brought a bunch of notes with him, which were written on torn notebook pages and crooked block letters. They were written with a bunch of mistakes that desk cop on duty that night had a field day with, but he didn't last for long. According to the priest, he regularly received those notes in the mailbox, first every 3 days, later every day, which was the reason he decided to finally report them. After being asked if he wanted to add something else to his report, he hesitantly added that recently he started to hear the sound of slaps in his apartment, as if someone was slapping linoleum in his corridor and kitchen with bare hands, very distinctly. When asked if he actually checked what it was, he answered that he was too scared to leave his room and just prayed to God, hoping for his protection. He was clearly worried that people would think he was just insane, and people at the station indeed thought so, but his report was officially accepted nonetheless. It was a busy period for militsiva, and since Priest didn't look well in the head, the case and those notes were forgone for a time. Around a week later, an investigatory operative group gets a call in the forest, around 200 and 250 meters deep, on the glade you can see in the first photo. A body was found, and not just some body, but as you have probably guessed, the body of that very priest. State of the corpse was pretty fucking terrible. Almost all the muscle tissues on his hands and legs were missing. Body was covered in livor mortis and blemishes. Facial features were distorted by the rot. He was also only recognizable so quickly thanks to his cross, which was the only element of his clothes, long hair, and beard. Later, it was concluded that he died 7.5 to 8 days before the discovery. Additionally, his body clearly was kept indoors for some time, since it wouldn't have rot so much in the winter frost. It was confirmed by the elderly guy who found the body, since he used to walk with his dog every day on the same route in the forest and only discovered the body that morning. Also, which was especially bizarre, many prints were found along the body. Looked like prints of human hands. They didn't look like handprints. They were the handprints. It was just fucking ridiculous at that point, quoting my grandfather. There was a trail of such prints leading around the forest. Strangely enough, not on the clear trail, but around it, in the snowdrifts. There was no evidence of the body being dragged. All the other prints belonged to the elderly guy and the cops. Previous night, there was serious snowfall, which would have covered the tracks, so body clearly wasn't there for long, and clearly didn't happen to appear there by itself. The questionings of the elderly guy, residents of the nearby houses, and guards of a garage cooperative close by didn't clarify much, though the elderly guy kept nagging about finding corpses of animals on that glade. Dogs, cats, rats, crows and such. He reported it to the milisiva many times, but nothing was done about it, and he had to bury animals himself. He also had to share his theory about Satanists with the investigators. The place itself was far away from anything. The closest houses were like 600 to 700 meters away. Same as that garage cooperative. No cars stopped nearby. No mysterious people were seen. Not even ordinary people with a big bag or parcel. Literally, fuck all. And that's when someone remembered about the notes. Earlier notes were rather simplistic, basically threats like, "Reject your faith or we will kill you." But those that came later were a bit more interesting. "Take off your cross," or "You will feed the hungry one with yourself." My grandfather quoted from his memory. There was more, but he didn't recall those. There were more, but he didn't recall what those were about, sadly. All of them had a bunch of mistakes, as I already stated. No handwriting expertise was done, to my knowledge, but those notes were quickly given away to experts in order to check for fingerprints, while investigators decided to visit Priest's flat. The door wasn't closed, though there was no signs of forced entry. Remembering Priest's words about the slaps on the floor, linoleum on his corridor and kitchen was checked, without much hope for fingerprints. But it was a sudden success. A few clear handprints. Huge fingers certainly were not the priest's. Fingers looked like they belonged to some hammerer or a smith, according to my grandfather. Other than that, everything in his flat looked in order. All the obvious valuables, like the icons, were still there, but there was no way to know for sure, since that priest lived alone and had no relatives, being an orphan. In short, the fingerprints on the notes were identical to those on the floor, but neither the local military station nor the bigger regional archive had those prints in their databases. Meanwhile, coroner reports stated that muscles in his hands and legs weren't eaten by animals, but neatly removed with surgical accuracy, using either a scalpel or a small and very sharp knife. No additional wounds were found on his body. No traces of unknown poisonings were found either. Millie Shiva had to start questioning members of Priest's church's parish. He wasn't seen there since the day he reported death threats to the local station. Obvious conclusion was that he disappeared after visiting it, since it happened after the evening service. So it happened either on his way home or at his flat, considering it was found open. Questioning his neighbors revealed that he probably didn't come home that day. One old lady even came to his door at around 9 in the evening to ask for some life advice, but no one opened. She didn't hear anything suspicious, or see anything suspicious either. it seemed to be a completely dead end. All the local invalids were checked, just in case. Investigators really tried to somehow work that strange handprint angle. At first, they started to check those that lived nearby, and after Chechnya and Afghanistan, there were many. By the end of it, Milischewa checked almost all town's invalids, but found no fingerprint matches. They didn't really expect any results at that point, to be honest, so they wrote it off to probable local cultists, which was really easy to do back in the day, because of the story that happened when I was a child. Even those 2 guys that were caught 2 years ago were questioned, but to no avail. Maybe it was their friends doing, or something, but I doubt it, since Moses Brandi seems too different. Of course, if the priest wasn't largely ignored when he came to the station, he probably could have told them something else, and that info might have resulted in solved case. But we have what we have, and it really smells like some mysticism, in my opinion. By the way, here's another photo of that place, made at around 11 in the evening. Those lights that I told you about in the beginning. Zooming didn't result in anything, and the flash on my camera was so fucking bright that I got scared and decided to leave that place in case I was seen. Know that I'm not a coward, but you know, that forest becomes really creepy when you know the story. The lights are on that place where the glaive is. Those are certainly not cigarette lights, too far away to be seen clearly. Possibly small campfires or motorcycle lights. There's no way to get a car there. It remains a mystery. So gentlemen, let's go further. There probably won't be much paranormal sounding stuff in this one. Central questions here is not how someone would do this. By why the fuck would someone do this? Let's go. It happened in 91, which was a hard time. Levels of apathy and general unprofessionalism in Russia were off the charts back then, which played a role in this case. No one was sure about tomorrow and future of their country. It all began with a call from a very bad address for a very shitty reason. Apartment complex where it all happened can be seen in a photo I add to this post. For as long as I can remember, this particular place was always considered bad and dangerous, but not because it had ghosts or some shit like that, of course. Reason was much simpler. It was a former dorm that in those times was filled with people from the very bottom of society. Robbers, knifings, and murders happened there regularly. Even I had a chance to see local customs personally when I was a kid. I was riding my bicycle nearby when a human head flew out of some window and landed around 30 meters away from me. According to some rumors, some drug addicts had an argument. But anyway, I was just telling this so that you could get a better understanding of what kind of atmosphere that place had, and why I didn't go inside to make some photos for you. Yes, I pissed myself. Getting back on topic, in one of the flats, the second floor, a family was murdered. Said family consisted of a single mother, her 7-year-old daughter, and as was found out later, a year-old infant. They were extremely poor, and according to the old lady living in the next apartment, poor thing was nearly driven to a heart attack when she discovered the bodies. The mother held no job, drank non-stop, and often brought suspicious men home. Daughter was practically homeless and never went to any sort of kindergarten or school. How did infant manage to survive in such a family is unclear, according to the grandpa. You should divide anything those old Soviet grannies say by 2 if you want to get closer to the truth. But it all looks shitty nonetheless. The door was slightly ajar, which allowed for bodies to be found. As for the bodies, at the first glance, it looked like a typical case of domestic violence, with some excessive force though. Around 30 knife wounds on each body. Wounds were at least 2 days old. Criminology experts' theory was that those wounds were inflicted on the already dead bodies. Mother was killed in the kitchen. Signs of struggle were all around. Furniture was overturned. Fridge handle was torn off. Some dishes broken. A bottle of uncharacteristically expensive vodka and some rotting delicacies were picturesquely lying on the cheap, dilapidated table. Daughter, it looked like was killed in her sleep because she was found in her bed, in an embryo pose. No signs of resistance. As for the infant, no trace of him was found, except for a baby's fence in his sister's room. Infant's very existence was only corroborated by that same old lady, and later, other neighbors. No diapers, No baby food. No stroller. No birth certificate. Nothing, which is considered the social status of that family. But even the surface search of the apartment revealed a lot of interesting things. Not only the freezer was chock full of expensive food and alcohol, there was also a very large sum of money hidden in the icebox. Literally, a few packs of money hidden inside cheap wrappings, which was a normal way to hide money and valuables from possible robbers those days. But what were they doing here in the apartment of these piss-poor people? That raised some questions because connection between those valuables and deaths was obvious. Further questionings of the neighbors and local alcoholics in the yard clarified 3 important things. First of all, murdered woman was popular here, if you know what I mean, and her door was usually open. Second, according to a score of witnesses, a strange man started to visit her in the last week. He clearly wasn't local, and even though descriptions slightly varied from witness to witness, they painted a certain picture. Uncertain age, completely bald head, always in the same brown 3-piece suit, patent leather shoes, and a bow tie. In short, it looked like he was loaded with some dough. No one could provide investigators with any distinctive details of his physical appearance or face. Such people rarely, if ever, visited this place. And it is a whole separate question as to why didn't anyone try to rob or just beat him up, cause that kind of people was not too popular in that house, to say the absolutely bloody least. Many people saw him entering the apartment complex and victim's flat, but no one saw him leave. Another thing was, suspect's interesting and unusual manner of speech. According to people who talked to him, it was florid, artsy, old-fashioned, and extremely polite. Sadly, no one could quite recall what the man asked them about, though all witnesses could recall that he had some questions, which wasn't completely unusual in such places, since inhabitants were usually drunk or on something. He was seen at least 3 times in the last week, though by the time Militsiva arrived, he wasn't seen there for 3 days straight. And finally, the third important piece of info: the moment this man started to come by the apartment complex, victim stopped receiving visitors in her flat for the first time in years. No shouts, no loud noises, no baby cries. Yes, infant's existence was finally corroborated by the accounts of most witnesses, but no one remembered dead women ever being pregnant. Bodies then were brought to a coroner. When they were loading them into the car, it looked as if every bone on their bodies was broken. Basically behaved like a couple of rag dolls. Further search of the apartment didn't provide investigators with any additional details. No signs of forced entry, no traces of blood, except for those on the victims. The bottle of vodka and glasses on the table were, of course, checked for fingerprints, but only prints that belonged to the victim were found. Doorknobs in her flat gave such a wild range of very different fingers that experts exhausted themselves to no end, just by comparing every set with what they had in their databases. In any case, almost all fingerprints belonged to local lowlifes, who haven't seen her in at least 2 weeks. Now, coroner's report was much more fucking interesting. Indeed, injuries on the bodies were inflicted when victims were already dead for around a day at that point. But this is not the interesting thing. Autopsies show that every bone in their bodies, except for the skull and cervical vertebrae, became extremely brittle and were basically heavily damaged by fuck knows what. They certainly weren't broken by the blunt force trauma, since there was no traces of such damage on the bodies themselves. Not to mention that it would have been a very tiring process breaking every tiny bone in the human's body. Also, bodies would look like a couple of torn bloody bags after that. Damage done to the bones reminded local Militsiva experts of the effects of a highly concentrated hydrofluoric acid. But there were 2 big problems with this theory. Hydrofluoric acid in such concentrations would have left extreme fucking chemical burns, considering that all of mother's and daughter's bones were heavily damaged. They had to take a bath in that acid to achieve such effect, but there was no surface traces of that. Second, this acid leaves such a chemical bouquet in a human's body that tests would surely have identified it. But the only irregular thing about their bones was the critical lack of calcium, and that was that. At the same time the tests were conducted, a call came from one of the witnesses interrogated earlier. He saw the suspect entering boiler house near the apartment complex. Not wasting any time, my grandfather got 2 operatives and moved out. Door to that boiler house temporarily was indeed open. Whether it was lockpicked by the suspect or left unclosed by the sloppy workers, it was never found out, but according to our regulations, that door must have been locked. On the photos, you can see that very boiler house. Kindly forgive me for not trying to get inside. There's an actual lock hanging there now, and trying to climb over the concrete walls with barbed wire is not a fun idea. So, my grandpa went there, and met 2 middle-aged women working inside. By the way, there's supposed to be 5 or 6 personnel working at all times, according to regulations. This is probably the reason why something blew up inside when I was a kid. They were noticeably twitching, and were not acting normal, as if afraid. When questioned about the suspect, they nervously laughed and denied any knowledge about him. The way they tried to bullshit me was pretty cartoonish, according to my grandpa. But at that point, my gramps didn't give much of a fuck about them. Just left one of his operatives there to watch the main entrance and those 2. The other one of his subordinates he took with him to more effectively conduct a search of the area. By the way, building was pretty fucked up. As you can see from the photos, it's very old and multi-tired. So everywhere there was moisture, rust, and only 1 out of every 10 light bulbs was working. So they had to get flashlights. In the far corner of that building, one that probably no one visited for years, Baby's loose jacket was found, hanging between the interweaving pipes. Grandpa and his subordinate started to frantically search everywhere in that area. They literally looked under every single pipe in that building, but found nothing. Even the criminology expert who arrived later had no luck with fingerprints, or any prints whatsoever. Baby's jacket had no traces of blood on it, or any other traces at all. It looked so clean, as if it was just recently washed. 2 women were called later for questioning. One of them kept stating that she saw or knew nothing, and the other one disappeared after the very first interrogation, as her melancholic drunkard of a husband said later. She just left home without even packing any of her belongings. Despite all the numerous questions, Milicheva never asked her husband and colleague. Despite checking all possible connections, nothing gave any result. For all intents and purposes, those women were completely normal. Even their fingerprints were taken and compared to those found on the victim's flat, but this naturally ended in failure. At that point, the case came to a grinding halt, and it seemed that there was nothing left to dig. Suddenly, a month later, another call came from the same apartment complex, from the same old lady who found the bodies. According to her, faint sounds of crying were coming from the now sealed apartment where the murders took place. Operative Investigatory Group answered the call. My gramps told me that he already physically felt surrealism of the situation. The sealed door of the dead apartment had no signs of forced entry, and Gramps indeed heard a faint sound of a baby crying inside. It took them half an hour to get inside of the apartment, and indeed, the infant was found there. Only he had no eyes. I mean, there was no blood or anything, just no eyes. As was later found out, they were surgically removed from his sockets. A thin layer of pink skin was covering places where eyes should have been, with tiny scars marking them, as if after plastic surgery. No injuries or pathologies beyond that were found. If you're curious about his fate, he was first brought to a child's hospital, then to an orphanage for infants. I don't know what happened to him later, but I suggest that he had a very unhappy life, though I am curious if anything else strange happened to him. So it goes, gentlemen. I am tired of typing this. Translator's note. Imagine what it's like typing and translating. It's a bitch. But I will add my grandpa's theory, and a couple of my own thoughts nonetheless. His theory was that the infant was basically brought from this alcoholic mother by that guy in the 3-piece suit, but something went wrong with the deal, and led him to killing the mother and the daughter as a witness. Method of murder itself was much less clear. Let's suppose knife wounds were either a way to lead the investigation on the wrong path, though murderer seemed too clever to think that they would fool the experts, considering that he clearly knew how not to leave any traces of his presence, or mask away that bone-damaging substance entered the body. Though injuries on both bodies seemed very random, some parts of the bodies were covered with injuries. while others were left untouched. And again, experts had no idea what kind of poison could have given such an effect without leaving any traces. Next thing, who would leave such a huge sum of money to a corpse? There really was a fuckload of money there, and only some poor woman who drank away her brains could think that no one would find them. But fact is a fact, money was there. How to tie it in with those two women from the boiler house, I have no fucking idea. By the way, the one that left never came back. My grandpa often returned to this case and checked out for any new possible information about her possible whereabouts. I guess someone managed to scare them really good, but there's no way to know now. Really. And fuck if I know what that baby jacket was doing there. Next, the infant. Where did the victim get him? Was he stolen? Left on our doorsteps? Scars from such things as eye removal don't heal in a mere month. As you might know, was it some other baby? But how and why? Also, those who saw the child before all this happened stated that he had a birthmark on the right side of his forehead. Baby with no eyes had exact same birthmark. I guess getting inside the sealed apartment wasn't much of a challenge since the killer might have the keys. But even without all that, I think there are many mysterious things about the story. That's it. You might fling some shit at me because this case didn't involve much in terms of paranormal, but believe me, next case has it in spades. First of all, I have to disappoint you because the most paranormal story will have to be reserved for later. I didn't pick the best of times to go out and make photos. Not only that, I almost shat my pants because of some creepy dude there, but also visibility was shit. However, a few of these photos will fit another story quite nicely. Use your imagination to envision the locales I'm going to tell you about, cause some of these places are too far away / too creepy / don't exist anymore. Still, I think you will find this to your liking. Here it goes. It's 92. The country's still shaken. My grandpa is still serving in Milis Shiva in our town. One day, weird guy comes to his station, acting all awkward and shy. Obviously nervous. According to Grandpa, he looked like a drunken bum in dirty, torn clothes. Despite his looks, though, he had both proper passport and legal address. In short, he told him this. In one of the farthest and worst parts of town, that consisted of garage cooperative and abandoned train depot. You can see the train depot gates on the first photo. I have no fucking idea why it glows green, but I guess it looks amusing. His friends started to go missing. By the by, I have no idea where the depot is even there. I've never seen a single train in those fucked up tracks in my life. Those people were not just some random guys, but true to life vagabonds who had some sort of spot there where they hid from people's eyes. Also, there was scrap and copper reception point nearby. Translator note: selling stolen scrap and copper was an integral part of survival for many bums back in the 90s. That explains why they sent an emissary who actually had some legal papers instead of one of their own, because no one wanted to spend their nights at a monkey house. Monkey house is a slang term for a cell that houses drunks and bums, or used as a scapegoat to help Milis Shiva to close some dead cases, which was regrettably a quite widespread practice back then. As he explained that something strange was happening there. Just 2 days ago, one of the bums walked away from the bonfire to take a piss and just never came back. Around 30 minutes later, his friends lit some sticks and went looking for him with those improvised torches. You never know, he might have fallen asleep in a ditch or something. But despite all their efforts, they failed to locate their friend. Although drunk bums are not very good at nocturnal search operations, let's be honest here. Their friend didn't come back tomorrow or the day after tomorrow either. They didn't think much of it, especially because a full bottle of vodka went missing that night too, which apparently was a commodity valuable enough for them to justify their friend's sudden flight. He didn't take any of his stuff with him, so they were waiting for him to come back, ready to kick his ass. But on the next night, another one of them went missing, under much more frightening circumstances. Similarly, one of them walked away from the bonfire to take a leak, but as soon as he left the circle of light provided by it and entered the bushes, he let out a terrifying scream that was abruptly cut short. This prompted the other bums to action as they rushed to his rescue. But at that moment, according to the emissary, they heard some sort of growl, which made them stop in their tracks. He didn't see much himself, cause no one thought to prepare torches for such an occasion, but some of his friends claimed to see a scary person who was grinning at them from the darkness. Barely dissipated by the weak light of their bonfire. To cut the long story short, they got really scared and went back to their bonfire, not daring to go to sleep till the morning. At that point, the bums were forced to take extreme measures and ask for help from one of their sworn enemies, the Milishiva. Legally speaking, Milishiva had no basis to reject his report, so it was accepted, discussed during the smoke break, and promptly dismissed as mad homeless ravings or some sort of prank. Cops had enough on their plate already, but next, disappearance forced them to ponder and act. One of the town's citizens disappeared, a simple regular guy who liked to drink and drive around in his car in his free time. According to his wife, he was a responsible family guy who never left for a long time without warning. But 2 days have passed, and there was no sign of him. By the way, fuck if I know why she didn't report his disappearance after the first 24 hours passed. And the last place where he was seen was, you've guessed it, that very same cooperative, which was situated near the bum spot, where he left his car and went home using familiar and shortest route. Old railway tracks. Connecting his disappearance with those of bums was of course an obvious thing to do. As you can see on the photos, forest closely surrounds the tracks from both sides. Similar situation is on the other direction, except there was a bridge there that you can see on the photo. I decided not to climb that bridge because I saw a corpse lying there in my childhood, which didn't leave me with a lot of pleasant memories. That corpse itself is not interesting. Typical story of the late 90s. After the bridge, there's more forest on the right and concrete wall on the left, separating the railway from old warehouses. They were almost abandoned back then, and by the mid-2000s, they were demolished. After that, some sort of building materials market was constructed there. But by now, it is abandoned too. I guess that place just had that fate. And it goes like that for more than 1.5 kilometers, till it reaches more or less civilized areas of town. At first, they suspected the bums themselves, obviously. But on the other hand, if any of them were guilty, he would have ran away after their emissary informed the Milishiva, but one cooperative was sent to question them anyway. Although he was either a dumb fuck, or the bums left their usual place, because they didn't find anyone. Meanwhile, my grandfather took a group of subordinates and went to visit those old warehouses, which were the obvious place to hide potential bodies. Besides, at that point in time, there wasn't even a single security guard working there. Skipping the boring details, what they found was a checkered shirt with some traces of blood that, according to the missing guy's wife, was on him when he left home. In addition, there was a lot more various trash and a couple of mattresses. The room they found them in was relatively clean too, in comparison to the rest of the warehouse. Experts immediately detected some sort of fingerprints there, and that's where a certain surprise awaited them. It was revealed that fingerprints belonged to 2 convicts who escaped some prison near Solikamsk whole 15 years ago and were largely forgotten about by that point. By the by, they were in prison for some pretty heavy stuff. Sexual assault and something else, as far as I could remember. One of them was local. The other one used to live in Moscow. The local one was 62 years old at that point, and the one from Moscow was 41. The next logical step was to check the address where local escaped convict used to live. His flat was on the first floor in a pretty bad part of town. The apartment complex itself was in critical state. It has been demolished by now, and the flat itself belonged to the town's housing fund for some reason. Khan would have been quite surprised if he chose to return home legally, I bet. But no one lived there anyway. It turned out that getting the keys wasn't a problem, since the door, a piece of plywood, was already broken into. The lock was torn out. Inside the apartment, or to be more precise, inside his bathroom, they found, without any exaggeration, a fucking pandemonium. First, traces of blood were found on the floor and walls of the corridor. and in the bathroom itself, there was a bath full of body parts, belonging to 3 people in total, though heads and torsos were never found, as far as I know. Apparently chopped with an axe, that wasn't ever found either. Those parts floated in dirty, cold water. No idea where they did get it, since water supply to the flat was cut off long ago. Stench of decomposition and feces was horrible. Toilet was literally covered in excrements, but neighbors didn't contact Milishiva, which was understandable since nobody lived on the first 3 floors, except for an ancient blind gaffer from the second. Kitchen had a portable gas stove, big tin can with traces of blood on it, half-full bag of potatoes, and a pile of human bones just laying in the corner. This is when the realization hit the operatives. Cons, whose fingerprints found everywhere around the apartment, were eating those people. Fuck if I know why, and for what reason. I mean, you can just steal food, like those potatoes, but they were eating them. Everything pointed to this conclusion. Questioning the other tenants didn't give investigators anything new to go on. Those few who lived there, less than 10 people in total, unanimously claimed that they have never seen any unfamiliar men there, but that blind old man said that night before Milishiva paid a visit to the flat, someone was trying to force themselves into his apartment for a few hours straight, but to no avail. Case was turning more and more serious by the minute. 2 operatives were left in the apartment to lay ambush, while my grandfather went straight to the prosecutor's office, demanding them to involve the federals, because this case was clearly out of his league, and he knew only too well who would have to answer to all this shit if it turned even more serious. Imagine that. A mass murder plus 2 wanted escaped convicts. Case was taken away from him surprisingly fast. Almost no one there even tried to argue with him. 2 operatives who spent the night in the flat almost went mad from stench and disgust. They were freed from their unpleasant duty, though murderers never returned to their apartment anyway. Everyone involved was thoroughly questioned by the feds. Grandpa himself and the immediate superiors got their asses kicked by them for sloppiness, but no one lost their office or got demoted. Who took this case over? What info I have left could be classified as rumors told during the smoke breaks. But if you start to tell the story, you have to finish it, even though I don't have all the details. Perpetrators' tracks were found not far from town, near a big forest that stretches for dozens of kilometers. There was a place there called the Lodge, even though it was in fact more of a country house cooperative, consisting of something around 40 houses. My guess, call came from there. Federals failed to apprehend both of them, though, and here's why. They were already pursuing them through the woods when suddenly they stumbled upon older one, lying on the ground and grinning like a madman. Apparently his friend broke his leg with something heavy and proceeded to escape alone. He was dragged to a car and interrogated, but no one managed to squeeze out a single word out of him. He just kept whining and growling like an animal. The younger one was never found, even though a search party combed through the whole fucking forest with dogs. The older con kept whining and shaking, all the way to the precinct, but at one point fell silent. Turns out, he managed to gnaw off his own tongue. Doctors managed to save his life, again, according to the rumors. He proved uncooperative, and was officially recognized as insane, and got locked away in specialized asylum for the rest of his days. Neither I, nor my grandpa, could vouch for a single word in a previous part, as you can understand. But there is only one proper version of events. No mysteries here. 2 escaped convicts were fucking around somewhere for 15 whole years, and managed to get to Ura, to Moscow. They probably went through a lot in their travels, and at some point were forced to eat someone to avoid death from hunger. Maybe another bum, or just some random tourist. Apparently, this experience took a heavy toll on them psychologically, and they acquired a taste for human meat. After that, they switched to a whole new menu, slowly turning more and more into a couple of fucking animals, if the older one was of any indication. And only here, in the Moscow region, they became bolder and ate someone who would be searched for, because finding them basically wasn't really that hard. But there's another factor. They had almost animal-like sense of danger, always managing to outpace Milicevo pursuit just by a day or two. That's it. By the way, it was really creepy taking these photos, knowing that in theory, one of them is still on the run, even though he must be really old today. Those locales now are very far away from any proper civilization, as it was back then. Also, I would never want to be in the shoes of that blind old man during that night. This part of the story always chilled me to the bone. This happened during the summer of '96. This case differs from the previous ones, because firstly, it happened in a good part of town, in which I lived, by the way. And secondly, because I heard part of this story firsthand, even before my grandpa told me about it. One night, around 1 a.m., a man burst into my grandpa's precinct, raving like a lunatic and holding a crying woman in a torn dress. After managing to calm him down, officers on duty started to listen to his story. He, 32-year-old, small-time businessman, was visited by some friends that evening and asked his wife, 27, housewife, to take their kid, 8-month-old boy, and go for a stroll around the block. What kind of visit, and from what kind of friends, makes you ask your wife to take your child and leave the house at 11 p.m. is a separate question, and some investigators tried to tie the visit to what happened next, and had certain success with it. After running some checks on those friends, who had pretty evident connections to a big local gang, he clearly paid them protection money, since both he and his business were doing fine, but I'll come back to it later. After around 1 hour and 10 minutes, he finally managed to get rid of his friends, and started to worry about his wife, who hasn't come back yet. When he came out of the house, he couldn't see her anywhere, and started to circle their apartment complex, shouting her name, when suddenly, he literally stumbled upon the overturned stroller, lying there in the dark. Stroller was lying on the asphalt road. You can see on the first photo. There was no lanterns on the road back then, and there are none today. The closest ones are something like 30 meters away, near the walkway, lying along the edge of the forest. So yeah, you can't see shit there at night. When he realized that stroller was empty, he started to seriously panic. But then he heard sobbing coming from the forest, and rushed towards it, where he found his wife, weeping and wandering between the trees, in a nigh unconscious state. Failing to get any sort of response from her, he just put her in his car and drove towards the precinct. My grandpa had nearly as much success. She was answering slowly, couldn't even recall her own name at first. She was clearly in a state of shock, so a doctor was called in immediately. But something my grandfather did learn, by basically asking her the same questions over and over again. To sum up her incoherent speech, this is what happened. She was walking along the very same road when something big rushed towards her from the direction of an apartment complex, pushed her away, grabbed her child from a stroller and ran towards an iron tower, and then into the woods. She followed this something to the forest, but failed to catch up with it. Also yes, this is exactly how she called it. Something. That my grandfather remembered very well. After that, there was a theory about a big animal, but I'll tell you about it later. The doctor, who arrived by then, examined her, finding bruises and small scratches that she probably received while pursuing the abductor throughout the woods. No further damage was found, but she was indeed in a state of shock. Doctor advised to give her some glycine, or glycerol. Fuck if I know. What I have written in my notes there. Don't harass me about it. Let her have some sleep, and advised to avoid stress. He chastised my grandfather for questioning her in such a state. He also advised to hospitalize her if her condition wouldn't improve on the next day. It was decided, without much hope, to conduct a search while the trail was hot, with the help of a cynologist and his dog. The iron tower was found pretty fast, 250 meters away from the spot stroller was found. There was an overhead power line, which you can see on the attached photo. I actually found 2 of such towers there, but the second one is too far away, and there are some more warehouses near instead of a forest, so I bet I got the right one. During the examination of the stroller, something strange started to happen. Dog, long-haired German Shepherd, a huge male. Saw that dog a few times in my childhood, and it was indeed enormous. started to act erratic, growling at the house, pressing its tail, ignoring cynologist's commands, who was pretty surprised by that behavior from an adult dog that never acted like that before. He was the one who proposed a theory about a large wild animal that might have caused dog, unfamiliar with hunting, to react that way. On the fabric that covered the stroller, there was a small torn gap no one paid much attention to. After all, it could have torn during its fall on the asphalt, covered in small pebbles and pieces of broken glass. But my father noted this anyway. Maybe he had some thoughts about it. No traces of blood were found inside the stroller or on the ground around it. They even double-checked it during the day. Nothing. But stroller was taken for an expertise anyways, which gave no results. When they finally reached the tower, despite the dog acting completely inadequate and outright refusing to pick up the trail, they started to ponder what to do next. There was no obvious tracks, and the dog wasn't helping, so the cynologist was dismissed, while operatives started to rummage throughout the nearest parts of the forest with flashlights, just to clear the conscience, but to no avail. In the morning, they have called the man whose child had gone missing, but he had reported that his wife had not become better, and that he was taking her to the hospital. She was sent to the loony bin for some time, but even after getting released, she couldn't tell anything new, as if she had lost her memory. There was only one connection left: the men's friends. But not to turn all this info into one of the boring episodes of Criminal Russia. Translator note: a once popular TV show documenting all kinds of juicy crimes. In brief, it did not lead anywhere. And look for yourself. The businessman was small time, to put it mildly, and demands followed his disappearance. And what was so strange and scary about this story, might you think? The fact that in a month's time, the same house had a similar case. Two brothers. The elder brother was 10, the younger, 7. Played behind the house, rummaged under the windows, hoping to find something interesting. The elder brother, naturally, was tasked by the parents to keep an eye on the junior. The rest is taken from the elder brother's testimony, after his father had taken him to the militshiva. It was a short while before 10 p.m., time to return home, when the older brother had suddenly noticed that the younger brother was standing still and staring into a dark alcove under the first floor balcony. You can see such alcoves on the photo here. Perhaps it's even one of them. The older brother tried calling the kid several times, but he did not react. Setting on his way to him, he froze in place when fur-covered paws appeared out of the alcove and dragged the child inside. And the kid did not make a single sound. How he managed to spot the fur on the paws in the dark is an interesting question, as there was no street lamps there. At first, the guy stood dead still and peered into darkness. For a moment, he even thought he had seen big white eyes. Something like that he certainly would never be able to see. And then dashed off as fast as he could back home to his father, who was sipping beer after a long day's work. And he, having smacked the lad for lying, went looking for the younger son with a flashlight. He had examined every alcove, but did not find anything at all, except a hole punched in the corner of one of them, which probably led to the basement of the house. But that hole was too narrow for an adult male. Only a child could get through. But the father wasn't intent to give up so easily. He took a crowbar and busted the lock on the basement door and climbed down there. Unfortunately, having gone through the entire basement, he had found nothing. There was a strong stink of rot that was verified by my grandfather, who examined the cellar later, and something else in the air, a strange, almost heavy smell, although grandfather could smell nothing of that kind. In the end, nothing was found. And that's all, folks. Funny thing is, I knew that boy from my childhood. We were in the same crowd. He was slightly older than me, and the story he told to the militshiva is nearly a perfect fit for what he told us after those events. He was never a particularly merry fellow and soul of the company, but after those events, he barely went out, became somewhat fearful and almost panicked when faced with the backside of his own house, flat out refusing to go there. So, on one hand, I personally believe it, but on the other, who knows what a story a child can concoct. But there is the matter of the woman's account, who again was in a state of shock and thus made a shitty witness, and of a guard dog, who would put its tail between its legs like a little puppy, which is slightly atypical. The animal version is doubtful, I'd say. Firstly, what kind of animal likes to snatch up kids without leaving any tracks? Seriously, 2 similar cases in the same place, and in a whole month, nobody saw anything? And secondly, if we take into account the hole leading to the cellar, no large animal would fit into it. There are, of course, the man's friends from the first scene, but as I said, there's just no sense in it for them. Since the second man in had nothing to do with neither with commerce nor with crime, and it would make more sense to steal both children, I reckon. So truth be told, I have no ideas what to think about this one. Unfortunately, that's all there is. The Anon with the investigator grandfather was never heard from again.